welcome to another episode of Healthy for My Purpose. Today we're going to be talking about your health and doing God's work. So we're really going to dive into, your life as a mission field and how does your health play into you really being successful in your mission field that God has given you. Um, and all of that other stuff. So we're just going to dive right in. So before we even get into God's work, let's just define what we mean by health. Because I know we throw that word out a lot, like be healthy for your purpose, your health as it is to God's work. But when we talk about health, let's define it, Gigi. What does it mean to be healthy? What is it? What are you talking about when we say health, when we use
Yeah,
that word?
I mean, simply put, it's just living disease free. There's a term
Mm-hmm.
called health span, and
Mm-hmm.
it's used in conjunction with looking at your quote unquote lifespan. So everyone knows what lifespan is. It's basically how long you live. So health span is similar, but it's basically looking at it in terms of years that you're living disease free. And so when we talk about diseases, in this context, we're talking about, chronic diseases, since chronic diseases make up most of the disease conditions in this country and in other Western countries. So things like obesity, type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, other forms of heart disease, cancer. These are illnesses that are brought on by lifestyle, basically, by our standard American diet that tends to be high in foods that are ultra processed, high in animal protein. They're high in calories, but low in nutritional value, specifically like micronutrients and phytochemicals, those bioactive compounds. So health is simply, basically just living disease free. And I think a lot of times we think that, if we take our medications, we're healthy. And not to say you shouldn't take your medications, but if your medications are to do things like lower your cholesterol or lower your blood pressure so that you can continue eating the toxic foods that cause the high cholesterol or the high blood pressure, you're still living in a diseased state because you haven't addressed the underlying root cause of the disease. You're just managing the symptoms through chemicals that help you to do that. So you're still in a diseased state.
Yes, yes. I'm glad you defined that because that really gives us some real context to what we mean by healthy, because a lot of times we age and many of those older years are battling disease. You know what I mean? And so, yes, we are living to a certain point, but are we living to a certain point healthy?
Right.
Or are we using up our energy and our resources physically, emotionally, spiritually to manage those diseases? And it does take a toll on us on how we show up in other areas of our lives. Because if you're using all of your energy on one level, something else is going to be compromised in a way. So yeah, I'm glad we defined that. So let's move into God's work,
Mm-hmm.
because I think as believers, this is a very important topic because when we think about our lives as Christians, one of the biggest sections or themes of the Christian life is doing God's work.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's all about us being the hands of God on the earth to bring God's kingdom into fruition. And so every believer needs to be sensitive to how am I carrying out God's work? Am I carrying out God's work? Am I doing it as effectively as I can? Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what accolades we have, it doesn't matter what things we achieve for ourselves. What's really going to count in the end is how did I do God's work in this earth?
Yeah. Yeah.
That needs to be our number one priority. And I know we have so many competing, things that we are trying to do, but if we do it through the lens of doing God's work, it's a total different aspect. Like for example, raising a family. If you look at it through God's work, like you have these responsibilities that you are raising other people to be productive citizens, productive believers, to do God's work and pass it on, then you now realize, wait a minute, I am doing God's work in an everyday manner, right? And so yeah, so we're going to dig into doing God's work. Now you're going to read a quote, Gigi, that we think is very powerful, that kind of really um, frames this idea of our role in God's work in a very powerful way.
Yeah, and before I read that quote, I
Mhm.
do want to just mention briefly, and maybe we're going to get into this later,
Yes.
but I just want to mention it now, is that God's work is all throughout the Bible. And you made a really good
Mhm.
point before we started recording this
Mhm.
podcast that we were designed to do God's work from the
Mhm.
get-go.
Mhm.
Um, I brought up the point about Noah doing God's work, and you talked about Adam. It even goes before Noah to
Mhm.
Adam. We talked about, just the building of the
The temple.
tabernacle
Yeah.
in
Mhm.
Exodus. But what came to mind just now when
Mhm.
when you introduced the topic of God's work was this thing around, worldly things that we want to do
Mhm.
that will oftentimes conflict with what God wants us to do. And
Mhm.
sometimes, we're in this state of disobedience where
Mhm.
we will want to do what we want to do or what we think we should be doing and ignoring, what God is telling us to do.
Yeah.
And I posted a Facebook meme last month, and it just popped in my head, and it said that they said Noah was a crazy conspiracy theorist. Then the rain came and the fact checkers drowned. And I just love that meme because it for me, it was kind of a testament of Noah's obedience, of really
Mhm.
listening to what God told him to do and doing it
In spite of. Mhm.
in spite of the naysaying, in spite of, what people around him might have been pressuring him or, saying about him. And he wasn't even, I don't know if he wasn't even worried about it or not, or, it didn't matter because at the end of the day, he did what he did.
Yeah.
And so I think we also need to kind of keep that in mind as we
Mhm.
continue this conversation around health and doing God's work,
Yeah.
because they're so interconnected. But the
Yeah.
quote that I want to read is from a missionary named James Hudson Taylor, who lived
Mhm.
back in the 1800s. And the quote is, God's work is not man working for God. It is God's own work, though often wrought through man's hands.
Mm.
So I'll just read that one more time because you have to kind of,
Yeah, you gotta have to simmer
yeah,
that into your
simmer.
minds. Yeah. Hmm.
God's work is not man working for God. It is God's own work, though often wrought through man's hands.
Yes. And I think what the difference between the two phrases, as I kind of repeat it over, is when you are, it's like when you are working for someone, the agenda of the work is not paramount. It's like I'm working for you. So, you know what I mean? I could quit, I could back off, whatever the case may be. I'm just a worker. But the other way, it puts emphasis on no, God just made us a vessel for God's work.
Mm.
And we are that gives a different sense of accountability and responsibility. I'm just working for the man, or I am the vessel in which God chooses to do his work. That comes with honor and responsibility and awe. And accountability and wait a minute, I've been given this task to be God's hands in the earth. What will I do with these hands?
Mm-hmm.
Will these hands be hands of wrath, of destruction, or will I allow God's work to come through these hands?
Yeah.
And so how we tie this into the health is, if God's work is going to be brought through us, then we have a responsibility to do the best to allow this vessel to be the most purest vessel that God could work from.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Yeah. I love that word vessel because
mhm,
it really does embody the physical component
mhm,
of doing God's
mhm,
work. And you
mhm,
cannot separate your health from your physical body. I mean, it's just the one and the same, basically. And
mhm,
so if we are the vessel, if we are the physical body, um, that God is using to do his work, we have no choice but to
mhm,
treat it with love and respect. And
mhm,
treating it with love and respect is a segue into what you feed yourself on the regular.
yeah. Because
And
yeah, I love that you said what you feed yourself, because, well, and sometimes you don't think of it this way, but I'm glad that you said this, love and respect. But what you feed yourself is an act of love, or an act of hate, or destruction, or confusion. Like, you are literally loving yourself by how you treat your body.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And I'll say that, I think for most people,
Hmm.
they don't see that connection between what they eat and
Hmm.
their health outcomes. But I think there's enough of them out there
Hmm.
that they know better, but they really struggle to do better.
Yeah.
And I think struggling to do better oftentimes is not having a rooted why behind making the change. So the inconvenience or the discomfort of leaning into foods that you're not used to eating, healthy
Hmm.
foods that you're not used to eating,
Hmm.
is much greater than a shallow why that we often
Hmm.
talk about in our boot camp.
Hmm.
And so it really does, kind of, it's all so interconnected with the why for getting healthy. And so if you can make this connection between your physical vessel, your body, and doing God's work and being obedient in doing that work,
Hmm.
your why all of a sudden becomes so solid and so like stable in pushing through,
Yeah.
the initial discomfort. And I say initial, I want to, bold it and italicize it and make the font bigger. I say this, the initial discomfort, because it will go away. It's not something that, you don't like the taste of kale, you don't like the taste of mushrooms, or you don't like the taste of whatever that's good for you. And then you acquire a taste the more you eat it. And then not only do you acquire a taste to where it becomes tolerable, but oftentimes you start to love it and miss it
Mhm.
when you don't have it.
Yeah. And the thing is, too, going back to the why, sometimes you might get the why intellectually, but practically you're addicted to the foods. And so part of that why, by developing the deeper why that Gigi's talking about, is going to allow you to say, you know what, I got to fight to get off of these foods. I got to break my addiction to food, and that's what we tackle in day 2 of the Healthy Christian Woman Boot Camp. So if you're someone who's like, you know what, I am learning now that I need to be healthy for God's work, but I am addicted to these foods, or I find myself, I just can't, I keep going back to them. I'm off for 3 weeks and I keep going back. The Healthy Christian Woman Boot Camp is a place where you can come to learn how to break your addiction to food. Because sometimes you get the connection, but you still have the problem. But the connection will have you say to yourself, by the hook or the crook, I am going to break my addiction to these foods. Whereas before you were just yielding into these foods and not resisting. It's about the resistance. We all at one point have been captivated by these foods, but it takes a conscious effort to pull away. Yes, it is work
Mm-hmm.
because we are so chemically, like even just the dopamine in our brain and all these things, we're so used to these foods that it will take some conscious effort, but that why will make you say to yourself, I'm willing to do the work.
Mm-hmm.
I'm willing to address this addiction. I'm willing to even see that it's not right that I'm eating these foods, or I can't stop eating these foods, even though I know that not only is it harming my body, but ultimately for the topic that we're talking about today, it is it is affecting the way I do God's work.
Right, right. And if you're listening to this and you're thinking, well, I eat a healthy diet, I eat a balanced diet, and those foods include things like, barbecued meats, cheese and dairy and, other animal-based foods, we'll provide a link to some information around the chemicals that are in these foods, because a lot of times people don't talk about them, and we deep dive in them in the boot camp, like trimethylamine oxide and heterocyclic amines and the cancer causing compounds in those in cooked meats. And so you have to really, I think, first understand if you have a chronic illness, or you're at risk of having a chronic illness because you've got, a quote unquote family history of these illnesses, just know that it could very well, it most likely is the food, because that's what the data shows. And the evidence is overwhelming when you look at all the science around foods that promote disease in the body versus foods that promote health and a healthy health span, I should say, a long health span. That when we're kind of looking at what's causing that illness or putting us at risk of that illness, it really does first come down to like knowing what the right thing to do is. And we do get into that in the boot camp. And then, overcoming that, breaking that addiction, as you talked about, Sersie. And, I think when it comes down to it, at the end of the day, it's an empowering message, not a message of fear or browbeating is the term we used to use in my corporate job, browbeating. But it really does come down to that we get to choose whether or not we are participants in our own destruction.
That's it. And that brings us to James Hudson Taylor. Tell us a little bit about his
Let's
story,
talk
because
about James
I
Hudson
think
Taylor.
it really highlights when you have control over your health and then you don't have control of your health, and how the difference in time it kind of plays itself out. So
James Hudson Taylor, his date of birth was 1832. He died in 1905. And I'm just going to read a little bit of this article, Sersie, just to set the context, and then we can have a conversation about it. And I'll include the link in the show notes for this as well. But he was born in England, and by the time he was 17, he knew that God was calling him to China. So this is a guy from, England, United Kingdom, and he knew at an early age that he was being drawn to China. He prepared himself by reading books on China, analyzing the Chinese Gospel of Luke, and studying medicine. 4 years of his term of service, which was 1853 to 1860 in Southeast China, was under the Chinese Evangelization Society, founded under the inspiration of Karl Gutzlaff. In 1858, in Ningbo, he married Maria Dyer, who was a faithful helpmate until her death in 1870. Although forced to return to England in 1860 because of poor health, Taylor had a continuing concern for the millions of Chinese living in the provinces where no missionary had ever gone. In 1865, he summed up his growing vision in China's spiritual needs and claims. And the same year, with great faith but limited financial resources, he founded the China Inland Mission. And so its goal was to present the gospel to all the provinces in China. And so by the time of Taylor's death in 1905, the China Inland Mission was an international body with 825 missionaries living in all 18 provinces of China, more than 300 stations of work, more than 500 local Chinese helpers, and 25,000 Christian converts. And so I'll include the link for the full article, but this is just kind of just to introduce it, a summary of it. But what was kind of interesting about, looking at this, and if you think about the diseases in the 1860s, they weren't chronic diseases. They were more like infectious type of diseases, communicable diseases, things that were related to hygiene and that sort of thing. This was because, things like antibiotics and vaccines really weren't prevalent in the 1860s. And so, you have someone who had to leave that mission work because of health issues at an earlier time, with health issues that were largely preventable. But we don't necessarily have that situation today because we have vaccines, we have antibiotics, we have things like, we understand the concept of disinfection and all of that. Instead, we have an environment of lifestyle-related chronic disease brought on by Western diets, standard American diets that promote these chronic diseases that we've been talking about.
What I found what was quite interesting was the contrast between the lack of control that James Hudson Taylor had over his health, right? Because like you said, these were infectious diseases. It wasn't something that they had the knowledge of to prevent and all of that. But then we fast forward to today, and so many of us, like James Hudson Taylor, have to come off of the mission field or brace back, or maybe not giving as much because we are participants in our own destruction with our health. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the contrast, and that's the difference, that we're in a very unique time in history where we have the ability to maximize all of the nutritional science to actually give us the best health possible. We can get frozen blueberries at any time of the year. That is unheard of, no matter where you live in the country. So you can get all those antioxidants at any time, in any place. So we have a unique ability to use the scientific knowledge that we have and to use God's food to nourish us on another level, right? But at the same time, we have been participating in our own destruction by eating all of these highly processed foods and eating all of these animal products and things that are now breaking down our bodies and playing a role in us not doing God's work to the best of our ability, or sometimes in certain cases, just either cutting our life short, cutting our resources because we're spending a lot on the medical and things like that, taking away from our mental and spiritual clarity, or just battling, our prayer life is caught up. I know sometimes our prayer life is caught up with God, heal me from this or heal me from that, and less about other things because we're consumed in this health system that robs us of our joy a lot of the times.
Yeah. And that's so important because, if God has a mission, for your life, like to do his works through you as a vessel, and you have basically, shortchanged God's ability to use you as that vessel. If you're eating foods that are destroying that vessel, destroying that temple, it then not only, you can't be obedient, you can't do his work, and all the things that he had planned for you are not getting manifested because you are on that phone scheduling the next doctor's appointment. You are on the phone calling the insurance company, asking them to cover this medication. You're on, you're going through the treatment and feeling the side effects, and you're wiped out for 3 or 4 days afterwards.
Yeah.
All those things. And then the people around you that are supporting you and helping you through the process are
Mhm.
also affected. A lot of times we don't think about the caregivers in the family who, are there to support and help you through it. And so their lives are being affected, your life is being affected.
Yeah.
And basically, God's work is just
And
not
yeah.
being done through you.
And here's the thing, guys, sometimes, we talk about those side effects, but let's get a little bit more drastic. The struggle is real. With diabetes, there's amputation, there's blindness, there's heart attacks, there's strokes. Like there are real catastrophic things happening every single day that so it's not even a gray area, because if your leg is amputated, if you're in dialysis and your kidneys are shutting down, if you lose your sight,
Yeah.
all of these things really take you off of the mission field. I know what Gigi was saying. You're like, yeah, but I can still do God's work. Yeah, I go to an appointment here and there. Yes, this is true, but the road that you are going down the possibilities of a stroke, or the possibilities of diabetes getting out of control, or high blood pressure leading to a heart attack or a stroke. All of these things are happening every single day.
Mm-hmm.
And we can't always assume that the mercy will always last for us, that, I'm just going to be the one that never has anything bad happen. We hope that's the case for everybody, but the statistics are showing that the number one cause of death is heart disease. So it's not working out well for everyone. It just isn't. And so we have to get aggressive, whether or not we are experiencing the symptoms today or not. We
Mm.
need to say, I need to walk the path of health, because I want to make sure that I am doing the best with what God has given me, so that I could do the best in my own power to move away from the possibility of those things.
Yeah.
We don't live in a perfect world. Anything could still happen. But I think, again, it's back to that vessel thing. What is my responsibility and my accountability to God being his vessel? And am I going to do the best that I can within my own power?
Yeah. And I'm just going to be very blunt here. I mean, especially if you know that you are abusing your body through your diet, if you know that already and you continue to do that, you're basically saying that me feeding my flesh is more important than obeying God and doing the work that he has called for me in my life. And it sounds crude and rude and harsh, but you know what, that at the end of the day, that's what it is. I mean, I'm not sure I can see another argument around that other than, Gigi, you could say it a little bit nicer. Yeah, I'm sure I could say it a little nicer and a little softer,
Yeah.
but that's the bottom line.
Yeah, it's our priorities.
It's our priorities.
What do we
Yeah.
place our priorities on? Maybe health isn't a priority, but at the end of the day, if God's work is your priority, your health has to be as well.
Right.
And
And
I think so long we go through this thing where we feel like I could do God's work and ignore my health. I think they're very attached,
they're very
because if our
attached.
body breaks down, God cannot use the vessel anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if our
And
hands fail us, there's no hands of God. And
right.
that's serious,
Right.
because if our hands are what is going to be the God showing up, and our hands fail because of what we put at the end of our fork, then we have just failed the mission of God in our own life.
Right. And I'll just add on that, when you really like really take this to heart, and I understand there's addictions that, like chemically in our brain, and there are definitely people who need more professional help and intervention. I'm not, I understand that, and I'm not necessarily referring to those when I talk so bluntly. I'm referring more to the person who says, "Oh, I just don't like the taste of kale," or "I just don't like the taste of, a salad for lunch. I'd rather just have a bacon cheeseburger."
Or
And
Gigi, or I just love this particular food and I can't give it up. I just love my ABC.
yeah,
I just love and
yeah,
I don't want to give it up. So sometimes it's I don't like, but it's also too I love and I don't want to give it up.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think, I think that when if you can eat a kale salad, for example, for lunch instead of a bacon cheeseburger, and you're basically choosing not to, that is really, that's the decisioning point around, am I really looking at my vessel as a temple of God, as that vessel to do the work that he's called me to do? And or am I not too concerned about that, but I'd rather, eat the foods that I like to eat
And
and
and just roll the dice.
roll the
Because
dice.
many of us were just saying, you know what, I just believe that I could do God's work. Because I think most believers want to do God's work and they cherish that. But they're like, I'm just going to roll the dice. I think I'm going to make
Yeah,
it. I think I'm going to be healthy. But the statistics are showing that the number one cause of death in this country is heart disease. So many of us roll the dice and it doesn't work in our favor.
right. Brought
And
on by
that
food. Yeah.
brought on by food, brought on by
It's the
lifestyle.
the
And
diet is
yeah.
the number one killer. You know what's second? Smoking.
So look at that. So you, I don't want to say it's safer to smoke than to, but the whole point, but that's just to show you, because when we hear smoking, all of us peak up, like we know smoking is deadly. We've already been indoctrinated with that. We know the facts now.
Yeah.
Food is now overtaken smoking.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So, guys, as we kind of close this episode, what we want you to walk away with is, are you passionate about God's work? If you're not, you should be. But if you are a believer, you know that God wants to use you, that you are the vessel in this earth, that He is going to make this world a better place. Um, and like James Hudson Taylor, who had no control but was on those mission fields in China, we have control and God has a mission field for you. And so part of that control is honoring our temple and making the best possible decisions that we know how to make, which is eating the foods that fuel our body and putting away the foods that damage it. It's really as simplistic as that. Um, and so the Bible always says, I put before you life and death, choose life. A part of it is going to have to be making that tough decision as believers to say, you know what, I'm going to choose life when it comes to my health. And I'm going to, um, make a 180 and stop choosing death that has been harming my body in the background, whether or not you have the symptoms or not, or straight up, you're on medication and you are feeling the effects and you see where this is going, or you might have already had a heart attack, or you're already on dialysis, or maybe you lost a limb, but you're like, God, can you still use me? No matter what, stop now. Don't dig yourself any deeper and make a new choice.